We have the honor of welcoming back to Third Place Books a man who needs little introduction, Mr. Ralph Nader. He is a crusader for the people, a political pundit, a presidential candidate, and an author among his many achievements. Mr. Nader's new book, The 17 Traditions, is his most intimate work to date. Mr. Nader explores the influences of his family, his upbringing, and even the geography of his youth, and how they continue to influence him today. The 17 Traditions resonated with me on an intimate level as well. I was able to recall my own youth and the things that influenced me as I grew up and within my own family. I'm sure that you will have the same kind of experience in reading this book as I did. So please join me tonight in giving a warm Third Place welcome to Mr. Ralph Nader.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm going to also note that we're looking for other family traditions. We want to spread a tradition of family traditions so that other families write down their own traditions and experience and the wisdom and insights of their forebears and pass them on to their children so they don't have to reinvent the wheel, if indeed you can ever reinvent that wheel. And it's 17traditions.com, those of you who are interested. By the way, thank you all for coming. It's always special here in Seattle. I don't know why, but someday I'll figure it out. Couldn't be the rain, could it? I decided to write this book for many reasons. One, it's just a love story from my mom and dad, who came here from Lebanon at the age of 19. And they had to adjust to a new culture and new language. And they raised 4 children, 2 sisters, 2 brothers, in a very interesting factory town in northwest Connecticut, nestled in the Litchfield Hills. This town was one for the books. It was the most contentious town I've ever been in. Half Republican, half Democrat, half Yankee fan, half Red Sox fan. Had more bars per square yard than any town east of the Mississippi, I think. And because it had a New England town meeting form of government, you went there, you were the legislature. The voters were the local legislature. Couldn't have a more democratic form of government anywhere. But there was a lot of argument back and forth, which is good. And my father had this sprawling big restaurant across from the textile mills. And it used to be said that for a nickel, you went to the restaurant for a cup of coffee and 10 minutes of politics. And it was a place where people came to figure out things in the town, to have a good time, to talk politics. Something fast food restaurants don't have today. And the politicians loved to campaign there. They loved to go down to Partners, the long counter. My father would be waiting for him next to the coffee urn. And of course, he never just liked to shake hands. He wanted to talk a little bit about what the politician intended to do or what the politician did in the past. And he never censored himself because he was a businessman. And sometimes his friends would come up and say, you know, Mr. Nader, you keep talking about these controversial issues and expressing your opinion, you're going to lose business. He says, no problem, I've already lost business. When I sailed past the Statue of Liberty in 1912, I took it seriously, don't you? These traditions, and there's no time to go into all of them, each one of them is a way they raised us. For example, the first tradition is the tradition of listening, learning how to listen. My mother would say, if you talk all the time, you're never going to learn anything. So learn how to listen. So when we were taken by them to the town meetings or the county courthouse, they took us to these events. We weren't fidgety, we weren't restless all the time, asking for Ritalin. We learned to observe. And when my parents had guests over for dinner, we didn't dominate the dinner time like today. It's very often. It was not about us. It was for us to listen. And once in a while make a comment, but not to dominate it. Learning to listen was followed by the tradition of the family table, which was basically conversation time. My mother told us that she knew what we needed to eat. We didn't. She would eat what we ate. Dad would eat what we ate. We ate what they ate. We were too young to know what to eat. And sometimes we rebelled against that. And we would say, I don't want radishes, or I don't want these turnips. And my mother would, she'd say, well, they're good for you. And then we'd persist. I don't like. And then she'd lean down and look us in the eye. And when she read to us, she never read to us, she had a memory of all these stories from her upbringing in Lebanon, because it was oral tradition. It was before electricity reached there. So they had to memorize all kinds of things, stories, proverbs. She didn't like to read to us because she wanted to look us in the eye and not read like that. So she'd lean down and say, I don't like this radish. And she'd look down and she'd say, who's I? You say, what? I don't like this. No, Ralph. Who is I? Is I your heart, your liver, your kidney, your lungs, your brain? Who is I? And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And she says, I know who I is. It's your tongue. And why are you turning your tongue against your brain? Eat your radishes. So, that one is an evergreen. That one will work on millions of children. Another memorable tradition was one of education and argument. And we used to say we're educated at home and instructed in school. And one day we were home in the backyard, beautiful spring day, the whole family, and my mother said, question time. And she said, how much are a dozen eggs? What about a loaf of bread? What about a pound of butter? Well, we knew all the answers because we were a restaurant family. So we wondered why she was asking these questions. And she paused, gave us her dazzling smile, looked up at the sky, and she said, what's the price of that sunshine? It's nice, isn't it? And in that nice, cool breeze, what does that cost? And look at those blue jays and robins singing those sweet songs for us. What's the price of those songs? And we, of course, were stunned. We just didn't know what to say. But, you know, just like drops of water on soil, it sank in and sank in that there were things in life that were valuable which had no price. And indeed, later on, in trying to dissect our beleaguered democracy, it occurred to me out of that event back years ago to say that there must be certain areas in our democracy that are never for sale. Otherwise, we can't have a democracy. Everything is for sale. We know who's going to do the buying. And so elections should never be for sale. Politicians should never be for sale. Childhood should never be commercialized and for sale. Direct marketing to kids undermining family parental authority. These little things always kept with us, and that's because, in one way, there is no TV set. We thought it was a big deal if we could listen to Fibber McGee and Molly, or The Shadow. Yeah, I can see a few people here who remember those. One day I came home from school, my father said, I was 10, he said, what did you learn today in school, Ralph? Did you learn how to believe, or did you learn how to think? Well, I went up to my room, thought about that one. And I remembered all the times I was told to believe even though sometimes it was factually erroneous, rather than to think in school. There's a tradition of sibling equality. They never favored one child over another. Like a lot of parents, they know that that could be a devastating scar for life on the disfavored child. There was a tradition of history. We were steeped in history. We read history. We were narrated historical sagas little by little when we came home from school at lunch. And it occurred to me recently that merely by teaching the tradition of listening and the tradition of history, that if my mother raised little George E.W. Bush, we wouldn't be in Iraq today. So, there's a tradition of scarcity. They never overloaded us with goodies, especially toys or sports equipment. Where one first base glove will do, that was it. Because they didn't want us to not appreciate things. And that, of course, extended into the whole idea of frugality, thrift, and our struggle now for energy efficiency and energy conservation, which doesn't just start with Exxon and the Department of Energy. It includes Exxon and the Department of Energy, but it also includes us in terms of the pressure we both put on our own habits, which tend to be a little wasteful, over air conditioning or overheating, and on our members of Congress. Then there's the tradition of simple enjoyments. Parents kept us out of commercial entertainment, except very rarely, going to a Yankee game. There were 7 trains a day from this town, 120 miles from New York. 7 trains a day to New York City. There are no tracks today, and the wonderful railroad station has been demolished, and in its place is a gas station. So there have been changes, for sure. There's a tradition of discipline, of course. And discipline had to be conducted in a way where it didn't diminish respect for our parents. And so they used proverbs. Whenever we got out of line, instead of saying, cut it out, stop it, don't do this, they threw a proverb at us. Well, we heard some of the same proverbs often. And the proverbs had a calming effect. After all, they are pearls of wisdom that have stood the test of centuries. And there was a proverb on for every conceivable occasion. We could never out-proverb them with our behavior. I had an aunt who knew over 1,000 proverbs by memory. She spoke in proverbs. It was such a delight just to provoke her a little bit. Out they came. A couple years ago, I figured I'm going to try my own hand at this. How many proverbs can I remember? And I never got higher than 20. English, American culture proverbs. I never got higher than 20. And I only got to 20 due to Benjamin Franklin. I never would have made it otherwise. How many people here know more than 20 proverbs by heart? In English? How many? You see this? We're losing it. We're losing it. That proverbs are a transmission of cultural wisdom and insight. They have been so polished that they're almost like a direct bingo, just like that, when they're hurled at you in a rather quiet way. If that didn't work, we had to stand in the corner next to the sewing machine looking at the wall, contemplating our prior misbehavior. So in that way, you see, we have to respect them. Where if they snarled at us, or if they swore at us, and there were neighbors where husband and wife really argued public. Sometimes the front door would hurl open. I remember once one husband ran out swearing, his wife followed him cursing with pots and pans, and the kids were watching this. My mother and father had their disagreements and conflicts, but never in front of us, because they didn't think that would lead to respect, and we wouldn't understand anyway. It was always in private, where they ironed out their differences. There is also the tradition of education and argument. I'll leave that to your imagination in interest of time, except that because they didn't prefer one child over another, and because they wanted the two older children to teach the two younger children, I was the baby in the family, and my big brother was an extraordinary big brother. When I was 12, he'd be going off to college after he came back from the Navy, and he'd give me 3 books that I'd say to myself, how can I possibly understand these books? One of them I remember was the philosopher James Harvey Robinson, who wrote a book of philosophy, and I sort of leafed through it, and I remember he made a big deal out of reverie, the importance of reverie. I loved that one because I thought I was wasting time. And that connected with the tradition of solitude. They gave us our quiet space, didn't, to use today's words, overschedule us. They let us gaze at the stars, follow the butterflies, work on our stamp collections, play with our puzzles, individually by ourselves. In fact, my mother wouldn't let my big sister join the high school choir until she learned how to sing by herself, to gain that confidence. There is a tradition of independent thinking, which is, that one was a beauty. They trusted their own judgment. They weren't looking for some PhD child development psychologist to tell them how to deal with their children on their first day of school. And because they trusted their own judgment, and they received the reciprocity from their children and learned from their children, their judgment just got better and better. And one day I was in the 3rd grade, and I came home whining, semi-crying, you know the type. And I said, the boys are wearing long pants. Apparently some of the boys were mocking me because I was still in short pants. So I want to wear long pants. Well, she said, why do you want to wear long pants? Because it's cold in the winter, and if I fell, I wouldn't scrape my knee. That didn't work with her. So I tried my trump card. I said, Mother, stood up tall, Mother, their mothers let them wear long pants. And she looks at me, and she said, well, Ralph, they have their mothers, and you have yours. And then the punchline. Why are you so worried about being a little different? Right there. Why are you so worried about being a little different? One day my father piled me into his car and he said, let's go for a tour of our town. My mother wrote an article once called Touring Your Own Hometown. Because, you know, there's a lot of things about our own hometowns, but even a small town. Never been to the factories, to the drinking water purification plant. Some people have never been to the schools. They haven't toured the wonderful natural surroundings, the lakes and rivers. They've been there, but they haven't toured the historical framework. It was a town where there were 2 rivers, the Mad River and the Still River. You can see everything was point counterpoint in this town. The Mad River was well named. Periodically it would overflow and destroy the main street, which is a mile long. This was a real angry river. And in 1955, it destroyed the main street and took about 11 lives in the Hurricane Diane, in August '55. And so she was determined that enough has been delayed to get a dry dam. We needed a dry dam to back up the waters. And she heard that Senator Prescott Bush, the grandfather of the current president, was going through town campaigning. And she went to reception, stood in line, got up to him, he was shaking hands, you know, quick, like the way politicians do, smiling all the time. And she got up there and shook his hand and said, Senator Bush, we've had this devastating flood, you know all about it. It's been on the news, no more loss of life, no more property damage, you've got to get a dry dam with the Corps of Engineers. And he's smiling, waiting, you know, ready to the next person. She wouldn't let go of his hand. There were about 10 people watching, and she wouldn't let go of his hand. I want you to answer me. I want you to promise. And he said, he suddenly turned serious. He said, I'll get you a dry dam. And he got the Corps of Engineers to build a dry dam, and we've never had a flood since. What was her lesson? Well, when you get up to a politician, you want an answer. You shake hands, don't let go. So, in that way, anyway, my father piled me into this car, and we go around town. He goes past the library. He said, that was set up by a $10,000 grant in 1900 by Miss Beardsley. Okay? He goes past the high school. That's the Gilbert School. That was established and built by a local industrialist. We go by the orphanage home, same thing. We go by a park, private philanthropy. We go by the hospital, the first one in the county, set up by 2 families, donated. Then we came to our house and he stopped the car, and we sat for a few minutes in silence. And he said, you know what? There are about 100 families in this town since the beginning of the 20th century who are at least as rich, if not richer, than these people. Imagine if they contributed those kinds of institutions as these people did, what kind of town we'd be living in. Now, he didn't let government off the hook for its responsibilities, but he was very keen on wealthy people, not just charity in terms of immediate soup kitchen type, but institution building. I mean, he gave hungry people in the Depression food, no questions asked, when they came in the restaurant. But he also knew that there had to be government action to deal with huge inequities of wealth, exploitation of labor, unfair taxation for people who couldn't afford it while the big guys got off. And he was very clear about that. But he was also clear that he had a utopian scheme that was good for 20 years of discussion in the family, is how to deal with greed and power. And he said limitation of wealth. Unlimited income you can have, but above $5 million, if you don't give it away charitably, it's taxed away. You can't believe how many discussions we had for that. That was good for the 8th grade, the 10th grade, the 12th grade, college, law school, but they'll evade it this way, Dad, and they'll get around it. What if they don't give to the right cause? He used it as a crucible for us to think hard about fundamentals. And you can't think much harder than about greed and power throughout history. Now, of course, the tradition of work. We worked in a restaurant. We did our chores around the house. Sometimes I couldn't believe how fast the grass grew. And the tradition of business. Now, this is a critical point that distinguishes our family values from the Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson type of family values. Civic tradition, going out in the community, entering into controversy if necessary to improve your community, was to my mother and father an extension of family values. Going into business, practicing business, was an extension of your family values. There was no demarcation. That you could be very nice in the family, but then really rip off the customer. And one day during World War II, a dentist who rented a suite in my father's building right above the restaurant came down and said he'd just been conscripted into the Army as an officer, and he was a bit concerned about his practice. And my father said, his name was Dr. Harry Garbus, said, don't worry, this suite will never be rented when you're in the Army. When you come back at the end of the war, drop by, have a cup of coffee, I'll give you the keys, and you can restart your practice. In World War II, you could rent anything. You could rent anything. He refused to rent it. That was his family value, incorporated into the business practices. Now, I want to extrapolate a bit here. There are millions of families in this country who have similar practices, similar wisdom, similar good judgment with their children. And their children grow up and they buy tape recorders and they got video recorders and they got cameras. And they take a lot of pictures of the family. But they tend to postpone writing down or recording the experiences, wisdom, and insights of their forebears. And as a result, it ruptures the continuity of the culture that they came from, if they were within range of immigration, 2-3 generations, and their own family traditions. And therefore, the children who now spend 30 to 50 hours a week looking at screens, computer screens, TV screens, video screens, wholly unnatural immersion in virtual reality, estranged from nature, estranged from the trees and the meadows and the rocks and the leaves right around their homes. And if they live in the inner city, they never put their feet on soil. It's all asphalt and cement. This is an inhuman environment in which to raise children, apart from poverty, which is bad enough. But even when there is no poverty, the time that children are spending with their family and adults, and just generally adults, is less than any generation in human history. And I think we're paying a price. The attention span is shrinking among young people. You've seen all that. Their vocabulary is shrinking to a point where they don't even have to contemplate studying Esperanto. 200 words will do, you know, sort of, kind of cool, you know, sort of, kind of cool. And their socialization is poor. Their memory of history is almost non-existent. It's watching screens. It's part of the massive spectator, bystander, onlooker culture. It applies to politicians. They want us to watch them campaign with their insipid slogans and evasions of issues, instead of participating, bringing them to our auditoriums when they campaign for back and forth, robust grilling on the issues, on the record, not just on the program, on the promises or the slogans. The spectator, onlooker, bystander, built in deep in our culture, is going to severely impair the fulfillment of their human possibilities throughout their life. Severely impaired. And I think this book, in its small way, will stimulate people, as Stephen mentioned in the introduction. Stimulate people, resonate with their own families. Oftentimes, familiarity breeds contempt or indifference, but stepping back, lots of people will see the good wisdom in their families that need to be recounted. That is, establishing a tradition of putting down family traditions so they can be extended, adapted to new circumstances and new technologies. Some people may say, oh, but the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they're completely different than today. You just don't understand today. Today is wild. It's crazy out there. It's lucky if you know where your children are. The same problems. Families today as families centuries ago, getting them to eat right, getting them to do their studies, getting them to respect their parents, getting them to think for themselves, getting them to not get in trouble with their friends and get into the wrong crowd. My mother was very careful to know about that. It's what I say on the cover of this book. While the garb may change, the wearer stays the same. So if you'd like to participate in this amassing of family traditions, the website is 17traditions.com. And if you'd like to have your children read this, I'd really love to see what the feedback would be from your younger children and other relatives who may want to feedback. If you ask yourself, what's the greatest source of active citizens in our country? It's not having a bad experience and going after it, although that is a source, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It's not the schools as much as it is the parental institution. So many things that happen for good or ill in our tormented world can be traced back to the way the family, the parents, raised the children. And am I glad I had a lucky choice of parents. Thank you. Thank you. We can have questions if you want to. I guess the PA system is here before we chat and sign books with you. Yes.
Is it okay to ask a question about something else other than this topic tonight?
I'm not known for censorship.
I thought it was.
Okay.
So, on I suspect you're familiar with Tom Friedman's book on the world is flat. And he argues a lot for free trade and argues that protectionism is very damaging. He does insist that with free trade you need to manage the downside of it. And my understanding is that you're not a big supporter of free trade, so I'd be interested in your responses to what he says in that book.
Well, Tom Friedman is not one of my admired writers. First of all, it's not free trade. This book is full of myths, and it's a bestseller. Corporations love it because it's kind of like a cheerleading book that justifies the overwhelming corporate globalization of our planet. It's not free trade, it's corporate managed trade. Because if you look at these trade agreements like NAFTA and WTO, they're like 500-600 pages, 800 pages. You know, if it's free trade, you just need one page. These are the rules and regulations. The other thing is international patent and copyrights, not exactly free trade, it's legalizing monopoly for drugs so that people in Africa can't afford AIDS drugs. They have to pay U.S. drug companies those prices. Well, we broke that with one of our drives. We broke Big Pharma on that. But generally speaking, it's a mockery of free trade. The point that Friedman misses, among many, is you can't have free trade with a dictatorship, because the dictatorship determines costs for labor and for many other things. Not the marketplace, not free collective bargaining by unions. The dictator determines the costs, and he's driving them down for the benefit of the multinational corporations who are cutting deals with dictators and back and forth corruption in return for concessions and licenses. We've seen that happen year after year after year. A personal story about Mr. Friedman. When he was misinterpreting the trade agreement legislation for millions of Americans for the New York Times and the networks, television that followed him, we called him up. And I can tell you, and I think he admitted it recently, he never read the trade agreements. He relied on memos that distorted it, and therefore he never understood that these trade agreements are forms of coercive transnational governance. They have sanctions if countries don't adhere to them, and they can undermine and override our own courts, our own legislature, and our own regulatory agencies. So it's a tremendous pull-down series of trade agreements, not just on workers, environment, and consumers, which Bill Clinton, after getting them through Congress, belatedly recognized. You know, he's a classic political redemptionist. But they are undermining our democracy. And we would tell the White House this, and we would do all this because we read these trade agreements. So the world is flat is as accurate as its metaphor.
I have a question going back to traditions. In terms of actually either continuing or renewing traditions, that seems to be easier than starting new traditions. As an example, I've been trying for years to get a Christmas tree out of my house. And I think I've been mostly misunderstood on that point. What is your advice in terms of creating new traditions?
That is a great question. And you know, we don't create our culture anymore because we have a commercial culture that's taken over. The corporate culture, the entertainment, Hollywood, New York. Just look at the music, where it's coming from now. They rip off the hip-hop on the streets and then they commercialize it. But basically, we don't generate our own plays and music. Country music was generated by people. Now it's commercialized. How do you start a new tradition? You start a new tradition by a particular pattern of behavior. It could be artistry, it could be narrating, it could be ways of bringing up children, serious, light, whatever. And then it's got to spread and get roots. So tradition is not just some nice way of living, but it institutionalizes itself. so it persists through time? If I knew how to answer that question, I'll tell you. I would tell you. All I know is keep trying. And
just in the Christmas tree with a lap dancing stuffed Santa, maybe that's a good
There obviously, I once made this point to the great folklorist at Berkeley, Alan Dundes, who unfortunately passed away, right in his class a couple of years ago. And he said, oh no, you don't understand. There's folklore being created as we speak. And he did give me some examples. But it's largely local, but it doesn't take hold, because if it doesn't get on the mass media, it often doesn't take hold. But it keeps sprouting. So all I can say is keep sprouting. It'll take hold one of these days when we have our own media, other than Amy Goodman. Thank goodness. Yes.
First, one quick question. Should we thank you for the tradition of seatbelts?
Yes? Even though... Oh, what a fight that was. When you look back on these simple things we take for granted, I was accused of wanting to put Americans in chains. Reagan attacked me for pushing airbags in his campaign in 1980. He thought it would interfere with American people's freedom. And I added, you mean freedom to go through a windshield.
So, segue into the second question. The other tradition we've been brought up with is that, as we should, the total respect for the people who serve us in uniform and protect our country, but hasn't that been, or here's a loaded question, hasn't that been exploited by powers that be in our government over the past since 1945, for example?
Oh yeah, unscrupulous leaders who lead us into criminal, unconstitutional wars, the first thing they do is they wrap the soldiers around their shame in order to have the soldiers cover them, because nobody wants to abandon support of soldiers. And Bush has done that to perfection. Here's this draft dodger with 2 draft-age daughters, and I wonder if he thinks the Iraq War deserves so much of our sacrifice. Why doesn't Jenna and Barbara join the armed services? Huh? This is why the Nuremberg principles, which are part of international law, come into effect, that no soldier, under military law in our country, is obligated to obey an illegal act in an illegal war. And once you have an illegal war, all the acts in it, all the deaths, injuries, all the knocking down doors are war crimes. And we not only have an unconstitutional war, but one that violates a whole series of international treaties that we have solemnly adhered to after ratification by the Senate. Yes.
I'd like to thank you for an excellent talk tonight. I think it's inspirational. But if I may, I'd like to ask you a question I think you've probably heard before about the 2000 election. I've been, just recently as it happens, reading Jeffrey Toobin's book, Too Close to Call.
Yes.
And there was just a remarkable statement in there that you took 97,000 votes in Florida, and that if 1 out of 100 Nader supporters had voted for Gore, he would be president today, and that's how close it was. And I'm wondering if you would comment on your candidacy in that context, and what it might mean for the upcoming election.
By the way, did you remember what Jeffrey Toobin in his book, Too Close to Call, concluded?
No.
That the wrong man was inaugurated after that election. In other words, that Gore won the election. See, and basically, the book was devoted.
He won the popular vote.
No, but he won the election in Florida. That was the book, was all about Florida. And he's a first-rate investigative reporter. He's a Harvard Law grad, works for the New Yorker, and he said the wrong candidate was inaugurated. Now, he did say what you said, which is, you know, if one person per precinct or whatever. And I called him on that. I said, Jeffrey, how could you say something like that? If we all have an equal right to run for election, then we are not second-class citizens because we're a small Green Party. If we have an equal right to run for election, We're either all spoilers of one another, taking votes from one another, or none of us are spoilers. And besides, you wrote that Gore won the election, and why didn't you go after the thieves instead of having that mischievous paragraph that you happened to catch? Yes. And I might say, and by the way, we all know there are 100 what ifs, right? What if he got Tennessee? What if Gore won Arkansas? What if 250,000 Democrats didn't vote for Bush in Florida? What if Kathleen Harris didn't steal part of the election by misdesignating thousands of good Floridians as ex-felons, prohibiting them from voting? What if? Why do they pick on the Green Party what if? It's political bigotry. They cannot stand competition. They think the two parties own all our votes and the rest of us shut up and stand in line. That's not going to happen.
I don't know about anybody else, but nobody owns my vote. And 1 million Democrats in Florida voted for Bush. What I want to say, I'm really envious, Mr. Nader, of your family. Mine was somewhat less than desirable. They did the best they knew how. I remember at the end of World War II, I'm 67, that it took 25% of one person's income to provide shelter. 30 years later, approximately, it was 40% of two people's income. When my parents were the hardest on us is when they were worried sick about money. As the old farmer said, it's the rich against the poor, and it always was. So that's a thing, I love what your father was saying. It's not that money, it's what people do with it. Response to that, but the other thing is, the question really is, and this is a parental tradition, not mine, corporal punishment, assault of children. I won't be unbiased about it. What do you think about that?
Well, my father were horrified when they would see parents in fits of rage throw a 3-year-old against the wall. They couldn't. And child abuse is just too much. It's just, I cannot believe. I remember the adults around our table when we had a guest. There are two things I remember sitting there as a kid listening. One was this point of child. Like, our parents, once in a while they'd go like this in the back if there was a painter or carpenter we weren't getting out of the way, we might get hurt. It's like this. They didn't use corporal punishment. But the second thing I remember is a friend of my father's who was saying, he said this in Arabic, he said, the hottest fires of hell are reserved for men who beat up women. Right there from the beginning. And I just, that's why I like the family traditions bit. Because, well, we all know, there are some families that are pretty broken up and harsh and abandon kids and so on. We got to emphasize the best practices and spread them. Because when you look at TV and families come on the TV, it's always dysfunctional families. Families that are ripped apart, and the worst examples are Jerry Springer, sadomasochistic type. They prep them to go up there. They have the bouncers. We want to witness families that worked. We want to see families that work.
Thank you. We've lost a lot of wisdom, and I'm wondering how many models there are to how people learn, adults as well as children. We don't have modeling for how to raise children.
Not only that, but late in his life, and both my parents just missed 100 years. And late in his life, my father said, there are two words I don't hear much anymore. I said, what are they? He said, thrift and wisdom. Yeah. Interesting.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Ralph. Happy birthday.
Not yet.
Not yet. You're a national treasure, so I do hope you're following some of your mother's diet.
Oh, yes.
Because we need you now more than ever.
Radishes and carrots.
And I don't know how you can spoil a bunch of spoiled milk, which is what was going on, because I think both sides are double sides of the same coin.
Political system is spoiled rotten.
It's spoiled. Yeah, so you are more the saver of the spoiled milk. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about the impeachment issue that Nancy thought you were going to put off the table, that the people seem to want on the table.
Well, I think, we ran on impeaching Bush. We had a petition on votenader.org in the 2004 campaign. Bush is the most impeachable president in American history. And not just on one bill of impeachment, on several. Center for Constitutional Rights.org will give you the detail. They've really put it together. And I don't understand if that's the only way the Founding Fathers gave us to hold presidents accountable between elections, why the Democrats are taking it off the table. Their answer is it distracts attention from getting out of Iraq, as if their strong program on getting out of Iraq. But here you had Clinton, who was impeached for lying about sex under oath. Can you compare? Nixon resigned, Agnew resigned. This World Can't Wait movement basically says, we're not going to get this Congress to impeach and convict. We're going to demand more and more people to say to Bush and Cheney, resign. Just resign, But Pelosi has a problem because she's next in line. So there's a modesty problem there.
Well, did you hear about the Washington State Senator who recently stepped up to the line and said that that's what he was going to do, even though he's a new state senator?
No, but good for him.
Yeah, and I love one of the things he said. He said, it's good to work for education, it's good to work for all the local health issues and all of that. But he said, none of that can matter when we have this big problem at the top. So he's going for the impeachment, like New Mexico, he's going to try to push Washington to do that.
Why don't you mention his name?
I can't remember it. Eric Olmsted.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We're 2 years from the election of 2008, and right now it takes $100 million that you have to raise this year before you even have
insane
any primaries. My question to you is, and I know you support public financing, but why has that been such a? It just seems like common sense. For a couple billion, basically, and give free TV time, you could have the federal elections every 2 years, publicly funded. What is the catch? What is the thing that's in our way?
Best bargain in taxpayer history. For $2 billion, you can keep the U.S. government from being sold every 4 years. And, to buy the U.S. government for $2 billion, that's even better than a fire sale at your local neighborhood. Given all the billions of dollars in corporate subsidies, handouts, giveaways, you name it, bailouts. You're no foreigner to that here. Look at the third richest man in America made you pay for the Seahawks stadium, which we almost beat him on 52-48. But when I came to Seattle to finish the battle, the press closed down on us. I've never seen a worse case. I left Seattle telling a reporter, this is the worst example of a closed press on an issue like this that I've ever seen. Seattle doesn't have the reputation of Mississippi on this. Shameful. And now they want to get you to do a basketball arena or something. You got to stop them on that. Now, here's the problem. The California Nurses Association had an initiative in California last year. They put $5 million in. They had more opposed to it, and they lost 2 or 3 to 1. And here's why. All you got to do is put in the minds of voters, a lot of voters, why should you spend one tax dollar to finance these dirty politicians? See, it's almost like a boomerang, isn't it? Effect. And my answer to that is, make it a $300 maximum voluntary checkoff on the 1040 tax return. They don't have to give a dime, but they can give each one up to $300. It goes into a public finance pool to be distributed to all ballot qualified candidates, and they get enough free time on TV and radio as a condition of the license to the radio and TV stations who use our public airways free 24 hours a day. We got to get something back from that. And, however, how do you get that message across if there are 20 ads to your one on TV financed by the other side saying, you don't really want to finance politicians, do you? So they've turned politics into a dirty word. In ancient Athens, politics was the antidote to autocracy. It was a clean word. Any Greeks here? No. I mean, they've turned something very good and the birthplace of Western democracy into a dirty word. Therefore, lots of people who would run for local, state, and national office don't want to get their hands dirty. They don't want to go through the grind. It's ugly. That's one of the main reasons that propelled me to run, when I met such good people who would go into elective office and do so many of the right things for the necessities of the American people, not want to have anything to do with it. So you have bad politicians driving out good politicians. You have dirty money in campaigns, most of it from commercial interests, driving out candidates who don't want to soil their hand and beg for it every day, like you say. McCain's going to have to raise $150 million. Hillary will raise $300 million before Bill stops burping, for heaven's sake. And it's disgusting. It's rancid. And then the press plays along by saying, well, I wonder who's ahead, who's raised the most money, instead of who had the best record, who involves the most voters in the campaign trail, who has the best concrete vision for the country, where popular sovereignty reigns supreme over corporate power instead of the reverse. What's UFCW? United Food and Commercial Workers.
Yeah.
20 million.
Okay. All right, can we have
never remember on laws.
Okay, it's just a good T-shirt. I didn't see it. Yes.
Hi, Ralph. I feel honored to personally thank you for running for president twice, giving us a real alternative. And one of my many concerns in the country, my name is Elizabeth Ann Sunrise. I'm born and raised in Washington, and George Washington and the two Harrisons are among my ancestors. I'm very concerned about the mass voter fraud being repeated. We have a number of things that are really important for election reform. Even England has no electoral college. And I believe a lot more people would have voted for you if they weren't afraid of the other Democrat winning. If we had instant runoff voting, that would help a lot more people vote, but also we need our media educating people. They aren't doing a good job in that area. But we also need the electoral college abolished.
Yeah.
And by the way, since when do we have to impeach Bush when he wasn't elected in the first place? There was mass voter fraud.
That's something.
Do you see, has anything happened to change that for 2008? Because I really deeply believe we need an alternative to the candidates that so far have come up. And even Obama did not talk about the major issues like lack of a living wage and homelessness in the wealthiest country on the planet. And this,
he will because John Edwards has been talking about that.
Oh, he has.
But it's interesting. I never, I like to try to predict what's coming up over the horizon that isn't very good. I never predicted the problem of not feeling confident your vote's going to be counted. I mean, good heavens, we're the laughing stock of the world. A few years ago, the Brazilians said they'd send observers and advisors to help us. They had got their system in pretty good shape. Now, there is one bright light that Florida should know better. They're going to throw out their optical scanners, and they're going to have voting machines with a paper trail so that you can detect the fraud and detect whether your vote was counted. And so maybe that will spread. But there's no doubt in my mind, after looking deeply into the Ohio election shenanigans, that Kerry made a serious mistake in conceding right away. And Edwards was arguing with him the morning after Election Day. They had argument after argument. for more than an hour. Ed was saying, don't concede too early. And Kerry was being advised by his key consultant, who had already been on 7 losing presidential efforts. He's now 0 for 8. Who told him, John, look, this is a defining image people are going to have when you go out for that news conference. And if they think you're a poor loser, you don't have a chance for another run. Well, he went out. He wasn't viewed as a poor loser. He just turned his back on millions of his voters who he kept saying, every vote's going to count, and I'm going to make sure it's not going to be like 2000. What's the most important characteristic of a politician once you get integrity? It's fortitude. Fortitude is a rare commodity. So look for that, and as these these people go through your city, as they all will, look at their early schedule, invite them to auditoriums, tell them we're going to do it different. We're doing it Seattle style. We're going to have the media be the observers, the audience is going to be the questioners, then we're going to give you, the candidate, time to ask us the toughest questions as voters, and then we'll wrap it up and send you on your way to Olympia. That's the way you should do it. Otherwise, they control the manner that they campaign, and they turn us into bystanders, as if they're parading in front of us. And not good. 2/3 of all voters are hereditary voters. They'll vote for the Republican or Democrat nominee regardless. That's not a good family tradition. That's what their grandparents do, and they just go and vote. So it's tough for a newcomer on a third party to start, because right away 2/3 of the vote are denied. Well, I know we could go on. I could go on, but we've got to do the book signing.
I just wondered what you thought can be done. Can we ask the United Nations to intercede?
That would be a good idea.
Bush repeatedly talks about democracy and freedom,
Yeah.
and he doesn't even
Understand.
demonstrate in his...
Why do you speak in such understatement?
True democracy.
That's right.
And why should the U.S. government be allowed to be on the Security Council when they not only violate international law and their own law, but they don't even pay their proportion of the dues?
Well, Jimmy Carter, who goes around monitoring third world elections, says he makes the countries adhere to 5 criteria. And he said he can't do it at home because we don't meet the 5 criteria. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for being here this evening.